Hey, welcome to The Explainer. We talk a lot about empathy, right? We often see it as the absolute peak of human connection. But what if there's something more, something deeper? Today, we're diving into this really powerful Korean cultural concept called Jung. And trust me, it's a bond that might just change how you think about your own relationships.
Right, so empathy is everywhere. It's held up as this gold standard for being a good, emotionally intelligent person. But is that it? Is that the final word on connection? Well, some fascinating research into Korean culture suggests there's this whole other layer, something more profound that we really need to explore. Okay, so just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's start with our baseline. The standard definition of empathy, right? It's the ability to understand and share someone else's feelings, to put yourself in their shoes. This is our starting point.
But then, in the Korean language, you have this word that is just notoriously difficult to translate. It's Jung. And you should think of it less as an emotion and more as a deep, quiet attachment that grows over years. It's not a sudden feeling, it's a profound state of connection that you build through shared history.
So, to really get a handle on Jung, we first have to understand the cultural soil where it grows. And that all starts with a totally different way of looking at the self, not as this isolated I, but as an interdependent we. Yeah, this visual just lays out the contrast perfectly. In a lot of Western cultures, we tend to operate with this independent self. See those solid lines? The self is this distinct, separate unit. But then you look at the interdependent self. The boundaries are all dotted. They're permeable. Who you are is fundamentally defined by your relationships, your family, your friends, your community. You aren't separate from them. And this core difference totally changes what we see as our life's mission. For the independent self, the goal is to be unique, to express your private inner world. But for the interdependent self, the main task is to belong, to fit in, to keep the group in harmony. And it's this fundamental idea of we-ness that becomes the fertile ground for something like Jung to even exist.
Okay, so with that foundation laid, let's see what happens when we put Jung and empathy right next to each other. Where do they overlap? And maybe more importantly, where do they radically part ways?
And this is where it gets really interesting. On the surface, both concepts share this idea of feeling another person's experience as if it's your own, but their foundations are completely different. Western empathy, especially in a professional context, often prizes a certain objectivity. But Jung? It's born from a pre-existing we-ness, a deep shared identity. And that can also make it incredibly exclusive to anyone who's not inside that circle.
Just think about the classic definition of empathy from the famous psychologist Carl Rogers. He says you sense the client's world as if it were your own, but, and this is the absolute key, without ever losing the as-if quality. You're a visitor. You always know that boundary between you and them is there.
Now listen to how Korean psychologist Song Chin Choi describes Jung. The language is almost identical, experiencing another's feelings as if they were your own. But the actual feeling is worlds apart. With Jung, that as if isn't a temporary visit. It's a shared reality. Their problem literally is your problem because your identities are so intertwined that the boundary practically dissolves.
And this kind of deep connection sounds pretty incredible, and honestly, it often is. But that same intensity means that Jung can be a real double-edged sword. It has a shadow side that we absolutely have to talk about.
Yeah, this powerful bond can create a fierce in-group versus out-group mentality. As the source material here notes, sometimes the need to maintain that Jung, that bond, can actually become more important than things like logic, reason, or even the law.
So what does this shadow side actually look like? Well, it can show up as favoritism towards your own people, a kind of possessiveness that can feel like codependency, or intense pressure to conform that makes you lose your own sense of self. It can even lead to this passivity, where you end up shielding someone's faults because criticizing them feels like you're literally attacking a part of yourself. And this isn't just theory. This dynamic can have painful, real-world consequences. The source points to the tragic Seoul ferry disaster in South Korea.
In the aftermath, some faith communities were criticized because it looked like they failed to empathize with the victims' families, seeming to prioritize their own institutional loyalty over the suffering of those outside their immediate group. So, after looking at the good and the bad, the light and its shadow, what does this incredibly potent concept of Jung actually teach us? And how can understanding it enrich our own lives?
All right, let's try to boil it down. First, Jung proves that our Western model of empathy isn't the only game in town. Second, the we self shows us this paradox. The same thing that creates deep bonds can also create exclusion. And third, and I love this, Jung embraces complexity. It knows our most profound relationships are a messy mix of good and bad. There's even a term for it, mi-woon-jong, which is like a hateful or annoying affection you feel for someone you're just so deeply bonded to. And ultimately, just understanding these different ways of being can give us a much richer way of looking at our own lives.
And as a final thought on this whole idea of ultimate connection, the source brings up this really powerful theological metaphor from Thomas Oden. He describes the Christian concept of the incarnation as the ultimate act of empathy. God not just visiting our world, but fully taking on our frame of reference, sharing our human condition, even unto death. It's such a powerful image of what it means to completely dissolve the boundary for the sake of connection. So, we want to leave you with this question. Take a look at your own deepest relationships, the ones that have been forged through years of joy and arguments and just life. Is a word like love or empathy really big enough to hold all of that? Or maybe like Jung, does that bond live somewhere beyond our everyday language? Thanks for joining us on The Explainer, one that takes what we often think of as a weakness and forges it into a totally unbreakable strength. So let me ask you something. I want you to picture a room full of people. Now, who do you think is the most dangerous one in there? Is it the loudest one? The one taking up all the oxygen in the room? Well, the answer might actually surprise you. Yeah, think about it. What happens when the most sensitive, most feeling person in the room finally decides they're done being a doormat? This is exactly where our story starts, a story about transformation, and it's rooted in some really deep psychological truths. Okay, so first things first, we really need to break down a huge misconception about what it actually means to be an empath. Society loves to frame empathy like this, doesn't it? As this kind of delicate fragility. You know, a person who feels everything is seen as someone who can be easily crushed. But that is a massive misunderstanding of what's really going on. The brilliant psychoanalyst Carl Jung, he saw something way, way deeper. His work gives us a completely different way to look at the empath, not as some kind of victim, but as a person with just immense untapped potential. And his whole framework really hinges on two key ideas that unlock this entire process. First up, there's what he called the persona. This is basically our public face. It's the social mask we all wear. For the empath, this is often that super agreeable, always understanding, very accommodating mask that they show to everybody. It's what people expect, you know? It keeps the peace. But it is not the whole story. Not even close, because underneath that persona, that's where the shadow self lives. And Jung argued this isn't just our dark side or a bunch of bad stuff. It's everything we've repressed. For the empath, their shadow is often where their power to say no is hiding. It's where they can set firm boundaries, where they find the strength to walk away. It's where they keep their spine. So what is it that sparks this whole process? What forces the empath to finally go looking for that hidden power? Well, it's not comfort. It's fire. An empath doesn't change because they read a self-help book or went to a weekend workshop. The change is literally forced on them. It happens through the painful, grinding, repetitive experience of being manipulated, of being taken for granted, and being betrayed by the very people they trusted. Now, here's the absolute key. This constant stream of emotional pain, it feels like it's just damaging them, you know? Just wounding their spirit over and over. But something else is going on just beneath the surface. A different kind of calculation is taking place. And this is the pivot. Their emotional sensitivity isn't a weakness. It's a highly advanced pattern recognition system. Every single lie, Every manipulation, it gets recorded, it gets analyzed, and it gets stored. The empath isn't just feeling, they are learning. They're gathering intelligence. And when that data, all that intelligence, finally reaches a critical mass, an unbelievable psychological process just kicks into gear. It's this kind of alchemy where the lead of all that pain gets turned into the gold of wisdom. Jung actually had a word for this, enantiodromia. It's basically the principle that if you push anything to its absolute extreme, it will eventually flip and become its complete opposite. The person who is endlessly patient becomes unshakeable. The one who gave everything away becomes radically selective. This isn't them breaking down, it's them breaking through.
So you can see the journey laid out pretty clearly. It starts with enduring the manipulation. That forces the processing of pain, not as hurt, but as pure data. That, in turn, allows for the integration of the shadow self, all that power they'd been pushing away. And the final outcome? It's psychological autonomy. It's true self-governance.
And this might be the most important part to get. The transformation doesn't turn the empath into some kind of monster. They don't become cruel or heartless. They simply integrate their shadow, that strength, those boundaries, the ability to protect themselves. They keep their heart, but they finally grow a spine.
So, what does this new integrated empath actually look like day to day? Well, their entire way of interacting with the world completely changes. The difference is it's stark. Before, they were always reacting from that place of hurt. They would just absorb all the toxicity from other people and were constantly looking outside themselves for approval. But after, they respond from a place of wisdom. They don't absorb dysfunction anymore, they just reflect it back, like a mirror. And most importantly, they are self-sovereign. Their worth is no longer up for negotiation.
This newfound power isn't about beating a manipulative partner or a narcissistic boss. That's not the point. The real battle, the one that they've now won, was never actually external to begin with.
This is the ultimate win. The victory is over the parts of your own mind that used to allow the manipulation in the first place, the parts that needed validation so badly you'd put up with disrespect. They have won the war within. And this brings us to the final form, what Jung might have called the individualized empath. This is a person who is, at last, truly whole.
In this final form, all the old tricks they don't work anymore. They become basically immune to guilt tactics. They can spot gaslighting from a mile away. They completely stop trying to prove their worth to people who are determined to misunderstand them. They just abandon the game entirely. And they operate from this deep, quiet well of self-knowledge.
And this is the final crucial point. The transformed empath isn't dangerous in the way a predator is. They aren't looking for revenge. Their power comes from the simple fact that they are now invulnerable. They cannot be manipulated, they cannot be controlled, and they cannot be broken again. And to a manipulator, someone they cannot control is the most terrifying thing in the world. So we end with this thought. We're all taught to hide our scars, to see our deepest sensitivities as liabilities. But what if that's exactly where the journey to real strength begins? What if the very thing that was meant to break you is actually the blueprint for your own becoming?